everybody. Great to see you all here. This is our first lecture of the fall semester, and a super exciting one, and completely privileged and thrilled to welcome Anthony Titus to the Cooper Union. And should be a great lecture series. More to come week by week as we go through. I think the poster is done and ready and should be announced so that we can have a great fall semester of conversations and introductions to bodies of work that expand the ways in which we think about and participate in architecture. And so maybe as a way of introduction, this relationship between art and architecture, which can go in so many different ways, and of course, art has always influenced architecture, and architecture has always influenced art, and there's been this kind of constant conversation back and forth, but it's very rare in which you find a person who is able to ask fundamental architectural questions through the art that they produce. And I think that Anthony Titus is one of those. He's an artist out and outright, and practicing and has been doing so for over 20 years now. But I think one of the fascinating things that he'll be able to elucidate for us tonight is the ways in which his art does not hover comfortably within any single genre, but moves between painting, sculpture, and architecture to ask questions about what does it mean to look at the space of representation as a constructed structural question of materials and forms in space. And what is that then as an embodied experience, ways in which we occupy the spaces of our world? Anthony is no stranger to the Cooper Union. Anthony taught here for many years, and when I first met him was 2005 when I came here, and some of my favorite memories are sitting on juries with Anthony, having conversations after studio with Anthony, and talking about the long legacy of Cooper. In many ways, actually, Anthony is the gentleman who introduced me to a history of Cooper from a direct experience, both learning here, teaching here, and being involved with everything that has to do with Cooper Union from the years of which he was a student. Anthony has his Bachelor of Architecture from Cooper. He also has a master's degree in fine arts from the University of Chicago. He's also a professor of architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic, and I've had the privilege of being on many of his reviews before, and he's an incredible educator. So this question of the ways in which he uses his practice to ask architectural questions through art is also fundamental to the ways in which he thinks about pedagogy. And some of those issues, maybe they'll come out tonight, or we can have conversations about them after the lecture. Will be, sure, fruitful and fascinating to discuss. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anthony Titus.
Thank you tremendously, Michael. And Professor Young mentioned we have known one another now for what is going on 20 years. And I want to thank him very graciously for his invitation, Professor Lauder, who I believe is also co-chairing the committee, Dean Eber, faculty, colleagues, friends, students. It's really a great honor, and it's okay. It'll keep me going. Whenever it goes off, move it along. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be here, needless to say. And it's, I think it goes without saying, anyone that spends time in a place like the Cooper Union, whether it's the time that I went here, the time before, the time now, has a profound influence. That experience has a profound influence in the life or lives of those people. And I'm certainly no different. The School of Architecture has always moved me as a place of uniqueness, and it continues, I think, to push new territory, to push boundaries, and you have a completely new generation of teachers, students who are collaborating. It's funny, when you said 2005, it got me thinking. And it was 30 years ago, probably to the day almost, that I was first in this room on that side, sitting as a first-year student in those seats. Well, I think they got new seats, but I was basically in that area. And, to have the opportunity to speak about one's work is really a privilege and a pleasure. And the reason I say privilege is because it affords us the rare opportunity to slow down and reflect and perhaps think about how we might change course in our work or in our lives and what we might want to do in the future, however long that future or short that future may be. So I want to really share one thing today, and it's basically the project of learning and teaching. As has been mentioned, I think I was fortunate enough to be in a school where architecture was, and I would say is, seen as a primary contributor to all of the bodies of knowledge of the world. And as such, it absorbs bodies of knowledge, literature, philosophy, film, in short, the arts, the sciences, the humanities. And I think it's probably safe to say that architecture, as much as anything else, is probably a way of thought, a way of seeing relationships. And those ways of seeing or thinking may lead to many different manifestations. Some may be built in the sense that we think of typically. Some may have to do with more ephemeral conditions, like the drawn, the imagined, or maybe even the painted. And I have found myself as a teacher and as a practitioner constantly trying to understand what it means to see a space perhaps between painting and architecture without compromising perhaps the nuances that any discipline fights very hard to articulate over thousands of years usually, unless you film and then it's maybe 110 years. But the work that I want to talk about today is really of learning, as I said. And about 2.5 years ago, I was invited to do an exhibition in Rhinebeck, New York, by Stephen Hall in his T-Space project, which is an amazing, unique space because it's a space dedicated to the confluence or the overlap of art, architecture, and poetry. And it's incredibly rare, as we know, to find spaces where you're invited to think carefully about overlaps of knowledge. In thinking of that project, it became very clear to me that it wasn't going to be a normal exhibition, so to speak. That is to say, the space was certainly not anonymous. The history of the building, the history of the site wasn't anonymous. And it had a quality and a character. I was reading a lot at that time. It's very rare that I get a chance to read these days. But occasionally you have concentrated time where you can read. And one thing that really struck me during that year of 2020, 2021 was the work of Richard Wright. Now, some of you may know Richard Wright. At one point, Wright was a very well-known, I wouldn't say household name literary figure, but probably close to it in the 50s, in the 60s. And books like Black Boy, which is a book that we were required to read when I was in high school, had a profound impact. He was an incredibly outspoken, radical, politically radical person. But there was this other part of his work that I didn't know about, and it had to do with poetry in the form of haiku. And the interesting thing about the haiku work that Richard Wright undertook was that it happened like in the last 18 months of his life. He was abroad in exile with his wife, his children, and he suddenly got very ill, and that illness led to a very early death. But in that period of time, he was writing haiku work, and his daughter at the time, who was maybe 7 years old, this is the very early 1960s, was like, "Dad, how did you manage to write this work? And you really look very sick." And he said, "You know, it's easy. It has a very simple structure of 5, 7, and 5. And if you pay attention to that, you can write a poem as well." And I thought it was fascinating. So I read through all 900 plus haiku works by Richard Wright. And one that really struck me, that just immediately hit me the moment I read it: "A falling petal strikes one floating on a pond, and they both sink." And I somehow knew that that was going to be the driving force of the exhibition. And as I mentioned, the name of the space is T-Space, and the shape of the building and plan is that of a T. It was designed by Stephen Hall, I believe, in the year 2010, 11. So the building is a little over 10 years old, and it has an amazing history of art and architectural exhibitions. Bryce Martin exhibited his Cold Mountain drawings there. Most recently, there was an Ann Hamilton exhibition, Turquoise Dyson, Richard Purrier. I mean, it's just an incredibly thoughtfully curated group of people over the 10 years. So needless to say, it's an honor and a great privilege to participate in there. So the first thing, for me was to try to read the space that was offered. In other words, it's a site. And one thing immediately came to mind, and it was the fact that the building was derived from the golden ratio, which is something that I think a lot of us are familiar with. It's a sort of underlying set of numerical relationships which tend to produce certain harmonic conditions. It exists in music, architecture, painting, design, the human body, and nature. And the question of entering a space of light with cavities, of shadow, wall projections, and situated within a natural environment. Oftentimes when one is afforded the opportunity to show work, as I said earlier, it's usually in a very controlled and anonymous type of space, which has its advantages, perhaps, depending on the work that you make. But it seemed to me that the key thing is to really pay close attention to the space. And as mentioned, reading Richard Wright, parallel to that, I started reading the works of the brilliant composer and musician Anthony Braxton, partly because a fourth component to T-Space is music. And I was asked if I would be interested in having two musicians who work with Anthony Braxton perform during the opening. And I said, absolutely. So I began reading his writings, and they're really fascinating. I mean, it's beyond the scope of this talk to get deeply into the ideas of these two, but I mean, just a fascinating visionary, and this notion of music and sound as related to color and space and form. You don't come across that often. If one begins with the question of the line of perhaps zero, what do you know and what don't you know? Okay, well, you approach a space, you make certain assumptions, and slowly you learn about it. And I think when you're working on your own, quote unquote, work, I think it's very important to question what you think may be the fundamentals or the foundation of your work. And in studying painting for, almost as many years as studying architecture, it seems to me that one of the beautiful interfaces, if you will, between painting and architecture is the wall. And I think this question of how a painting touches a wall or doesn't touch a wall is crucial. It's often something we don't pay attention to. It often goes overlooked. If you go to almost any gallery or museum, typically it's 2 nails or 2 screws, a wire, and it's on the wall. And there is something quite beautiful about that because it's so direct, it's so simple, and it took probably tens of thousands of years for us as a species to say this image could actually move very easily from one place to another. So there's something beautiful about that. Yet at the same time, I think there's an opportunity to think about the space of embedding a painting, of projecting a painting, of applying one directly to a surface. And it seemed to me that this particular project was really asking for a kind of dialogue between the beautifully constructed geometry of the T-Space gallery and perhaps a body of work which would serve to contrast that or to ask questions. So in a sense, a call and response. And very quickly, it seemed to me that relatively large gestures of color would be a possible solution. So like all of us, when we have ideas, you start sketching in some form. That might be with physical models, drawings, words, images, dreams. And slowly, as you begin to form things, language is also working. And, as I get older, I find that, maybe it's best to stick to index cards, because if something can't fit on an index card, it's probably too convoluted or confused for anybody to understand, including oneself. So I really try to identify single words. When I'm talking to students and I'm trying to get them to write about their work, I say, start with one word. And I said, what will help you find another word? And they look at me like this, and I said, a dictionary. And they said, okay. And I said, if you really want to get fancy, find yourself an etymological dictionary. Do you know what the word etymology means? And they said, I said, it means essentially the root of something. And it's a wonderful act to just choose a word and find its opposite. And just by one word, you can find another, the antithesis. And if you go, before you know it, you have hundreds of words. Anyway, I'm trying to stick to index cards. So the question of what it would mean to place color, forms of color, bodies of color in that space became very important to me. And I remember Dr. Kumpush, who is sitting here in the front row, when we started talking about the exhibition and went to see the space, it was kind of amazing because it was pretty obvious once we got into the space what objects needed to be placed where. And strangely enough, the installation took maybe 4 hours, 2 hours, an hour, half hour, 6 days, I don't know. But it kind of snapped together. And one thing became apparent immediately was that the light of the space and the surfaces of the paintings were really speaking to one another. And this is something that I somewhat anticipated with these very simple paper studies. But needless to say, you can never predict how something reads in its reality. And this question of the frame of painting, the edge of painting, the barrier, the border, these are things that I've always been interested in. And I would say, if maybe I'll embarrass all of my teachers in the room today by if I can remember saying something that they told me, and I'll save it for later. But this question of structure, and how do you perhaps peel back the surface to reveal what might be behind? Is there an apparition? Is there a trace? Is there something that can be brought to the fore? Is there a way to slowly shape what we used to call picture plane, or the surface of a painting, so that it goes from being an illusion in one sense to being physical and real? And this is a kind of conversation that many painters, I think, have been involved in, particularly over the last 50 or 60 years. And I really think that there is something important about painting, in part because it has a very low threshold of entry. And I think there's something incredibly beautiful about the fact that anyone with relative means can actually make something called a painting. A good painting or not, I don't know. But there's something incredibly appealing about that to me, and it always has been. And I think the strange paradox is that the entry point is relatively easy, but because the means are so reduced, it's very difficult to find something perhaps unique, if we can use that word, or something that might be slightly radical or very radical, because so much has been done in painting. And I think everybody sitting here is well aware of the conversations about the death of painting that have happened over hundreds of years. I mean, Michelangelo famously hated painting. If he had his choice, the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel would have been carved. And, he didn't really, 500-year-old gossip, he didn't really even think of Leonardo da Vinci as competition for him. Because he said the guy paints kind of, somewhat, not that often, and he only made one sculpture that he couldn't even finish. Right? So someone considered to be at the height of painting was very skeptical of painting, right? And you find that throughout history. If you get to the 20th century and you start reading the manifestos, whether it's by Mondrian or von Doesburg, and many that came after, many of them thought of painting as a threshold, not something to reside in as an endpoint. Mondrian thought of his paintings actually as architectural relations. That's a rough, bad translation from the Dutch. But I think there's something also very interesting about approaching a discipline that seems to always be on the verge of dying. But it never, from what I've seen thus far, seems to actually depart. Somehow there's a trace of it that remains, and people are compelled to do it. I mean, I imagine if we were to go up to the 6th floor right now, your colleagues in the art school are probably dreaming of painting in the same way you're dreaming of architecture, that there's a future in it for them. And I think that's wonderful. And thinking about what it could mean to be in a space where, again, color floats, surfaces inflect, and the light, most importantly, the light changes over time. That was crucial to me. There's a very strange thing also with painting, because needless to say, all of us have been saturated with images, primarily for the last 20 to 25 years. And I would really encourage those of you youngins who are here for 5 years, 4 years, another 3 months, to really go out into the world, which includes museums, and put yourself in front of paintings. Put yourself in front of drawings or around paintings in certain instances. And there's a very interesting thing you discover. It's probably one of the few disciplines, at least that we still have, where you can actually read the register of time in terms of how it was made. In other words, many paintings actually show you how they're made. You can read the first mark and the last mark. And what's interesting is sometimes you can't tell which came first, right? That's when things really get complex. But it's all there in one place. And I don't think there's another place in culture that we have at the moment that does that. There's something about the solitude of painting, which is perhaps antithetical to the collective nature of architecture as we typically think of it. But I think that balance is important. And I would imagine the reason why so many architects, great architects, have engaged painting as a counter voice is because it is a very difficult space, I think, to navigate. And some people don't come out of it. You can read all the stories of, again, we don't want to go on the gossip of other people, but it's a wonderful space to put yourself in front of and into, if possible. And I think it potentially reveals new possibilities of framing, of threshold, the relationship between that which is artificially constructed and that which is out in nature. And again, the wonderful thing about this particular building was that it had passages to the exterior. So you were looking at the site from the interior of the building. So the white wall condition that we typically lament in the art-architecture relationship was actually not so dominant in this condition. And I really think it gave me an opportunity to think carefully about material. As I mentioned, at least for me, the painting beginning point is very simple. The materials I use, basic canvas of different types, basic paint that's acquired from any reasonably good hardware store. Sometimes, occasionally, I buy something from an art store, but it's really simple means. And I think that one of the other interesting contrasts between architecture and painting is that architecture, as we know, in many instances is driven by the unfolding of technology, particularly the last 200 to 300 years. It's almost impossible to keep up with the technological unfoldings in architecture. For painting, I would say the two biggest leaps in technology in the last 170 years would be tubed paint and canned paint. And because of these two very simple, seemingly mundane conditions, the entire discipline of painting, and as such, how we see the world, changed. I mean, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum or MoMA or any other relatively close museum, and you look at the history of painting of the 19th century or the 20th century, you really see a simple shift in technology have a massive impact on how we see and recreate the world. And these paintings, in many instances, that were generated in the 19th and in the 20th century, as we know, had a huge impact on architecture. All of the isms, the cubisms, the suprematism, surrealism, constructivism, you find at the core of those experiments architects, painters, designers, poets, musicians, and in many cases, people overlapping, people doing more than one thing. And I think that question of the interstice between, the space between is key. Again, the question of elevation, of things moving, shifting, floating, is important. And the gravitational question of painting, to me, is fascinating because it's typically not thought about as something that has immediate importance in painting. But occasionally, we remember that the world does pull in certain directions. And I think there are moments where you sometimes get lucky enough to capture something that's in a state of transforming itself or moving from one state or place to another. And I think the drip is fundamental in certain moments. Usually these paintings take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's hard to say. And I think anybody who makes anything, that it's impossible to put a date on something because who knows? You go back, you find something, you think you did something, you kind of remember, but then it shows up again and, who knows? But I can say for the work in this particular body that I'm sharing with you, it's years. And the years, it's really about the slow forming of the surface, because in some of these works, there are perhaps 20, 30 layers of paint, which slowly accumulate and congeal over time, so that eventually the surface of the painting, if you will, becomes self-sufficient and actually very hard and stable. And that's what is interesting also, is that painting marks time in a very powerful way. It's an all-at-once condition, unlike literature or film or music, things that unfold over time. Painting is really about the position of being in immediate proximity. Now, if one really manages to experience a profound painting, I think, of course, it lingers, like any work, right? It lingers in your mind, and you change your perception of it or of other things, and when you go back to it, maybe, if you do, you see it differently as well. And I think that play between the all-at-onceness and being in space, in light, in relation to other elements of nature is what was crucial. The ability to stand underneath is also unique in a certain way, because you often don't get to see the underside of a painting, the back of a painting. And I actually think every element of the painting is important. I sometimes joke with friends of mine, if you want to understand how a painter thinks, look at the painting obliquely and look at the sides. Occasionally, painters actually show you, consciously or unconsciously, everything they're thinking, just about how they choose to treat or leave the edge of the painting. I don't mean the frontal edge, I mean the dimensional edge that turns. And that is, for me, crucial. When you think of painting as light and color and form, I'm always fascinated to imagine what happens before you have the ability to make something. And what are the words or the sounds or the memories that hit you? And as I mentioned earlier, sitting here, it's very surreal for me because I have been in this room many times as a student and as a teacher here for a period of time. But as I also mentioned, almost 3 decades ago to the date I was sitting here as a student, 18 years old, out of a public high school in New York City, High School of Art and Design. Tore our building down some years ago, but the school is still there. And trying to think back to some of those first experiences. And, Professor Sugasao, who is sitting in the front row, was one of our great, great teachers. And I don't want to say how many students Professor Gus Howe has taught, but it's safe to say if you've come through the School of Architecture at Cooper Union, you probably have studied under Professor Gus Howe. And just about anybody out in the world who is making and thinking and teaching from the school had her as a foundation teacher, parallel to Design Studio and to all of your other courses. And I remember one very beautiful Friday where she took us probably 35 students, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and told us, for admission, simply dig in your pocket and take the smallest coin you can find. That's your admission, which I still use only for the Met. The other ones.
It was to give them only a penny club.
Yes. And there was one artist in particular that we spent the entire year in foundation drawing studying, and that was Cezanne. It was more than Cezanne, but Cezanne was one of the key figures that we studied. And I had never really, maybe I saw some of the work before as a high school student, but not really in any serious way. And to have a teacher spend time outside of class on a Friday evening and to simply gently walk you through a museum and at times say something as simple as, for instance, do you see what Manet is doing with the cross of the boat and the clouds? It's almost like the beginning of Mondrian. Not an exact quote, but... And 3 decades later, I still remember that kindness and that guidance. And to think of this question of teaching it's a very strange question, because the teaching and quote unquote practicing seem to be at odds in so many respects. At least in my case, I practice pretty solo. I've certainly worked with people over the years, but I kind of have a rule, like the index card rule. If it's something I kind of can't do myself, maybe it's something that I shouldn't be doing consciously. Don't ask of others what you won't do yourself. But to teach is a really incredible thing as well, because it requires, I think, a very different part of the brain. I think when one is in one's quote-unquote studio, you really can't think too much about what other people think about or what other people understand. Yet to be a teacher, I think all you can think about is how someone else may understand something. And when I'm in teacher mode, if I'm reading or watching a film or listening to music, I can never relax. I'm always thinking, okay, how would I explain how Martin Scorsese uses the hand as a device for 58 years in filmmaking to my film seminar? I can't just enjoy The Departed, I do, but it's, and it's this incredible thing. So when you get the rare opportunity to reflect upon maybe the space between your ability to make things and to perhaps teach, it's wonderful. And most recently, Stephen Hall and Toshiko Mori, I believe the project is still going on. They're collaborating in a historic 10-issue special edited Domus project, which I believe started back in December of last year, in January, and is probably going through the end of this year. And I was invited to contribute an article in February. And the article that I contributed was essentially about the space between teaching and my studio work, and in particular, the ability or the possibility of painting in the 21st century. I can't say early anymore because we're almost 1/4 of the way through the 21st century. Is there a possible space of exchange between, particularly for foundational students? In my 21 years of teaching, I've been kind of fortunate enough to have almost 3,743 students, give or take a few who dropped off at the end of the semester. But that's essentially the number. And that comes from studios and seminars and 4 summer studios for 10 years and all the other crazy things that people invite you to do. And you say, yeah, I'll do it, of course. And then you're like, why am I doing this? But in the end, you realize that it's so that you learn yourself, needless to say. And the one thing that I've had as a consistent condition in the decades of teaching are first-year students. I've taught thesis students, graduate students, occasionally doctoral students, but I've had first-year students every year. So I get a year older and they stay the same age every year. And there's something, I think, when I'm in my better state of mind, I think profound and beautiful about that as a gift, that every late summer, early fall, September, I get the chance to wake up and start again. And start with a new group of students who have maybe never heard of Picasso. I mean, it's so beautiful to say to a student, hey, have you ever heard of the Beatles? And they look at you like this, and you think, well, why should they know the Beatles, right? There's a wonderful opportunity to say, there was this crazy guy named Ringo Starr. Great street fighter he was. Let me tell you his story. So to work with a student and introduce them to a painting by Frank Stella, for instance, and ask them to think about what it could mean to interpret that painting as a space of habitation for single inhabitant that you have to define. And to work with a student, 18 years old out of high school, for a couple of months is to me, what keeps me wanting to teach, as difficult as it gets at times. But there's something I think so important about giving back, as silly as it sounds, because, if you can remember a teacher taking the time to show you something and be patient with you, I would think, owe that to as many people that come under you as you possibly can give to. I think that this question of making and concentrating as much as you can is the great challenge, I think, of our moment. The distraction that we all face on a daily basis. I mean, if you're 18, you probably got a smartphone when you were 3 or 5. I mean, a student who's 18 is born in 2004, 2005. Now, I mean, it's insane. It's beautiful, right? And the screen is the reality of that mentality. How incredible to say, hey, listen, when it's funny when you say you have to make a model, they say, you mean in Rhino or like a real one? Your choice. We'll talk about it on Monday. But this question of the physicality of things and the opacity, the weight of things, but then there's also something about the beauty of lightness and levity. And, I never want to hear the word pandemic again, like everybody here, but the one thing that did offer, I would say, as an opportunity as an educator, is to reduce the question to an even greater degree. If you're distanced from people and they have no ability to even acquire material of any significant form, what can you ask of them? If you have a printer and access to transparent film, can you begin to introduce color and ways of tying and forming and shaping that into a new tectonic landscape of sorts? Can simple materials that can be held by someone and slowly manipulated so that you discover different properties, is that a foundational lesson that you can offer to someone? What can you do with something so simple as paper? Again, it reminds me of the relatively beautiful and simple means of painting, which doesn't require a lot, in a sense, other than the ability to sit and want to unlock something that's in there. And if a student eventually decides that things can float and receive light and bend and turn upon themselves, is that possible? It's interesting when you think about the condition in which we live at the moment. And I know I'm probably in the great minority in my optimism that I have about the world. I think there's no time or place any better or worse than any other time or place in the larger collective fabric. And when I think about something as simple as 12 or 13 students that I get to meet every fall who come from all over the world, they don't know one another. I don't know them for sure. And by some strange freak chance, almost every aspect of the planet is represented. Never before in history, to my knowledge, would that have been so readily possible. If nothing else, that is something to celebrate. And I tell my students, sometimes with greater belief than others, but I really believe, I say, you have wonderful futures. And I said, be very careful not to misunderstand that, because one of the easiest and oldest tricks in the book is to convince someone or a group of people that what they have is worthless. And then they give it away, / have it taken by someone else. So yes, there are plenty of challenges. We all know this. But if you're in a space of education, you're already incredibly wealthy, beyond belief. Just your thoughts, the fact that you're sitting in a room, us here, and not trying to beat the light to tend someone else's field for the rest of our lives, which almost everybody in this room would have been doing 300, 250 years ago, is astounding. So when I think about some of the students, and there are many, many others, but some that have worked closely with me in projects in school and in studio, I think of some. I would call all of their names out, but I have to protect the innocent, of course. But these are wonderful people, and when I think about what they hopefully give to the world through their work, whatever that work is, it really makes me want to keep teaching as a way of being in the world. But it's difficult. And as I mentioned, at the end of every summer, I don't think anybody really here knows the Twilight Zone, but there's a wonderful episode of a woman who goes into a department store on a very, very hot summer day. And slowly, as she's walking through this very, very upscale department store, starts to notice that mannequins are winking at her. And then eventually one says something to her and she faints, ends up in the store manager's office, lying down on his couch. She comes to, she says, "Where am I?" He says, "Well, you fainted, ma'am." "Really?" He says, "Why don't you lie down here, get some rest until you feel better, and then you can go." She lies down, she wakes up, it's about 3:30 in the morning. The entire department store, of course, is closed and empty, with the exception of the mannequins. And as she tries to make her way out of the department store, slowly the mannequins start to come to life, one by one by one by one. And they start to call her Jane, 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 and slowly start converging on her until she collapses and is about to have a nervous breakdown. And one mannequin steps forward and says, "Jane, have you forgotten?" "Forgotten what?" "You're one of us. We each get 30 days to come to life and go out into the world. It's my turn. You're already one day over." I always think of having to go back as like the mannequin. Yes, but again, when I see those faces, okay. But what does it mean to keep at it? About a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I had the great fortune of traveling. I hadn't traveled in a long time, 3 years, 4 years, not by choice, but it's just what happened. And I missed this massive Matisse show. I say Matisse, so I said, I missed this massive Henri Matisse show, great French painter, the other titan of modern painting. And the last day of the show, I found out that it came down. And when I read the press for it, the biggest show in Japan in 20 years, borrowed work from the Pompidou. I'm kicking myself for 4 days, 3 days. And then 4 days later, I end up in another museum. There's a beautiful Antonio Gaudí show, the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, designed by the father of the architect of our Museum of Modern Art, Taniguchi Sr. And on the wall, there was a poster for a Josef Albers show. Museums there, they advertise for one another. But I only had one more day, and it was about 2 hours, an hour and a half outside of Tokyo. I said, I have to see this show, because if I miss this, then I'll really feel like a damn fucking idiot, right? I mean, you miss one, all right, you miss two, your fault. So I got on a bus, and I traveled out to see this show. And it was fascinating because the museum was empty, minus the guards. And I got off the bus, and the work of the show had to do with Albers as teacher and as painter. And it wasn't a huge show, but it certainly did a tremendous amount to show the range of his work. And a few things became clear when looking at the show and then reading parts of the catalog on the way back to Tokyo. His great, great contribution as a teacher, which we all know, the interaction of color, which again, every student in the art school, I have to imagine they're still required to buy that book. The book was initially published in 1963, and it was the work that Albers did with his students at Yale. He was 75 years old when that book was published. Then I'm reading more, and I realize he was 32 years old when he started studying art at the Bauhaus. 32. And he came in to study glass arts, which I don't think he wanted to study, but Gropius said, "You're going to study this." He said, "I don't want it." He was probably this older than, "You're going to study." He was so poor, apparently. He would take his knapsack and a hammer out to the town dump and break bottles of glass, put it in his knapsack, and go back to the studio and make paintings. So those beautiful little glass paintings that Albers made as a student at the Bauhaus, he didn't have any money. 32-year-old man, right? But I saw this little film. It's a beautiful film made by Hans Namuth, the same filmmaker who made the beautiful Jackson Pollock drip film. And again, I was just reminded of the power of simplicity. It's scary when you hear him say, "I divide the square into 3 or 4 major zones. Rule 1. I never mix color, maybe 1 in 100 times. I saw one painting in there where he did mix, which I like better than the other, but anyway, his rules, not mine. And it's applied with a palette spatula knife. That's it. And each one has a stainless steel frame, and the frame is either floating from the wall or touching the wall, and either has 4 screws or 8 screws, depending on the size of the square. And he spent pretty much the last 20 years of his life making those paintings. So you travel, I've come to understand something, for me at least, and traveling, when I go places, I just walk for 10 hours. And I says, "Where the hell did you go?" I said, "I was just walking." My physique doesn't show it, but I can walk for 10 hours. Okay? And I don't believe that there is any place, thing, person who is necessarily any better or worse than any other. And the question of relationships in the world, how light hits us all. Where do you fall in the shadows? If you fall in the shadows, what's in front and what's behind? When I have time, I just walk. Because if you walk, you really see partly what people want you to see, but mostly what people don't want you to see, what we don't want to see. So sometimes you have to walk for 7 hours before you see what Tokyo, quote unquote, is really like. And as I move into the current space of mind, I'm working on 5 books, which I'm going to finish, 5 buildings and 5 paintings, and getting a truck driver's license so I can give that back to people when they do it unnecessarily to us. But this question of reducing and going back to what might be some of the principles of one's work. Okay? If you have this belief or this sense that the front, but also the side of a painting, the inside of a painting, the space between the wall and the painting are important, then perhaps you should draw that. Right? And you should look closely, if you can, at the way in which a surface changes over time and how it forms or drips. And the traces that might inform you in the future, giving you some insight into how to push forward. You know, there's a funny thing also. When you work in the context of a community, such as a school, there's this very strange kind of movement because the teachers, they slowly form over time, and there's an energy that generates, and the students, they move through and they have an energy that they generate. And if you sometimes try to map the time question of when a student first discovers something and when a teacher first discovers something, occasionally there are overlaps. You know, I asked the students, you know, what musicians would you say are defining your generation? And one told me Doja Cat. All right. But, you know, I know the first time you hear something, you know, you know, I remember the first time I purchased this album in 1990, Saturday, September, 1st September, in the West Village, and I went with my friend, Finn Tran was his name, and he said, we're gonna go to the village and we'll go to Bleecker Bob's. I said, Bleecker Bob's record store. So we went to the record store, and I bought this cassette, which was already 7 years old at the time. And I remember I took it home, and I put on my mini Sony Walkman, and I said, I gotta go back on Monday and get my money back from this fucking crazy guy who sold me this album. It's defective because nothing could actually be this fast, distorted. The album is only about 20 minutes long. So I went back on Monday, and Bob of Bleecker Bob, excuse my French, by the way, was there. And I said, excuse me. He says, what is it? I said, well, I was here on Saturday, and I bought this album, and I think it's defective. He says, what are you talking about? I said, well, it sounds weird. And he said, give it to me. And he turned around and he put it into the cassette player. And he listened. He says, that's how it's supposed to sound, kid. Go. And so I carried this around with me. You have no idea, by the way, what it takes to carry one thing around for 30 years and not lose it. I'm proud of that. So if anybody finds this sitting on the table after, I'm counting on it. The first time you experience something, that's the question that I want to leave with. And it's the question that I want to begin with. When I go back to studio, and when I own a studio as a teacher, again, I think that there is something important about community, there's something important about a school, and I think there's something very important about the ability to have a moment where you can think and reflect upon work. Some of the work is your work, some of the work is that of people you collaborate with or only think about. So I am very honored to have been invited here to share some thoughts, one aspect of my practice, and to have the opportunity to think. So I want to thank you all very much for inviting me, and I would look forward to any questions or conversation. Thank you very much.
So, you know, we do this thing where it's kind of like moderation, but the moderation doesn't have to be that long. And in whatever manner we want to play this fast and loose, we can talk amongst ourselves, because I think it is that kind of intimate situation. You've opened it up with, by the way, Rock for Light, Bad Brains. This was a key moment for a lot of us at a certain time, and I couldn't believe that it could be that loud and that fast at the same time as well. Something. We're of that generation.
We are.
Yeah, it's our Doja Cat.
I still think it's probably a little defective. Not answering the phone these days.
But so I'm going to start with a question, and we'll see what it unlocks, and maybe it goes nowhere, but then we'll turn it over and we can talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about. You said a number of things which were amazing, Anthony, but the one that I kept coming back to in my mind was the gravitational state of painting. And I think there's something in this that is key to one of the distinctive things that you do as an artist that remembers or harkens back to your training as an architect, and maybe to the pedagogy that you put forward as an architectural professor. And I'm thinking about it because, of course, there is within painting gravitational ideas that are structural to the ways in which a composition is organized within a frame. Of course, there's within painting gravitational ideas that were explored from the 50s onward, Morris Louis to Jackson Pollock, where the pigment's cut by its relationship to the surfaces, horizontal or vertical, and the pour or the drip. Of course. But you're doing something different here. And it's a great image because it actually is at some level the materiality of paint itself becoming so viscous and held in a suspended state that we begin to sense it as a bodily experience of gravitation itself, which is an architectural question and a question of our bodies in space. And I think it goes back to you may be one of the few people who's ever started a conversation or a presentation on painting with a section of the wall. And that section of the wall, which you also ended with, the interior poche space of paintings, having bodies and bellies and things embedded in them, to put into question where that plane is and to give it its kind of physicality, both as a material, structure and support inverted. So now the support surface of the material is its structure, and its viscosity is its gravity. And I know that at some level I'm rambling, and at some level there's a whole number of things that have been linked there together that can be teased out in different manners. But to start a question of painting from the different poches of sections in the wall is a distinctly architectural contribution to something that was often thought of as a hole in the wall, a window. And that thickness, I think, has a kind of gravitational weight that I would love to hear more about if you care to share. You got another one?
I would play some of this music, but I couldn't find my boombox, so we just have to try this. Thank you for the question. I'm going to try to figure the way into there possible. Different. Well, let me start by saying I'm a television kid. Like probably, I don't know if television is still a real thing, but I grew up watching television. I mean, I think one thing about my generation, whatever that generation is we were, kids probably born in the 60s, 70s, very, very early 80s were left to their own devices. And the term latchkey kid, I think, was a new term that was invented, which basically meant you came home and after school, maybe, and your parents weren't there, so, just try your best not to burn the house down or get arrested or whatever. And television, I guess, was one of those things that made you just sit and look. And I always found television fascinating, and the screen. So in many respects, I can understand the fascination with the screen, whatever the scale is. It's miraculous. I mean, I don't think an overstatement to say it's probably as mysterious as what do you call it when you can't figure something out? An enigma? Like the enigma of the pyramids and how they were built. The generation of images with particles of light, probably as fascinating. So if you grow up watching television and your vision is shaped in that way, it's about flatness and some strange weird non-depth, it probably does something to you. And with painting as a dimensional thing, again, to go back to the earlier conversation about Cezanne and this question of structure, and just at that verge of pushing through and making painting something else was I think, planted in my head maybe in the first year here. And I think the paintings, many of which you are not here, which you will ever see, hopefully, but, between these and the earliest days of painting for me were about trying to reach a physicality. And maybe that was in contrast to the flat background that I had as a child. And it's probably just a natural response to the screen. But I do think the screen of the last 20 years is a different screen than the 30 or 40 or 50 years before. And I probably have less interest in the flat screen today than old. But I'm probably not answering your question, but I think this question of being in front of something that's physical, that can deliver a certain type of knowledge or experience that cannot be experienced in another way. I don't think this work is photographable in a certain way, although it's beautiful to have photographs. I think it, like many works of art, buildings, books, need to be felt in their intended presence. And the three-dimensionality of it for me is an extension of that.
Makes me think of Videodrome. Debbie Harry. Yeah, well. Okay, so by the way, we could do this all night, and at some point I'm sure it's not going to be that entertaining. Questions from the audience for Anthony? Things you'd like to discuss?
Darts, insults, arrows.
Yes. Okay.
Very good.
In the late, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was lovely. In the later slides, when you were showing the section through the paintings, and then there were these circles that were coming from they were connected to the section. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about those drawing section, elevation, side by side.
Okay, so I don't get myself in trouble, I'm not going to put the image up there. I say what I'm going to say. If it's not accurate, you can't hold me accountable. The air between, and I keep having this idea that one day soon, not one of the 5 buildings now, but soon, I'm going to work on a dome. And across the street from the building that I grew up in Coney Island was something called the Half Moon Hotel. And it was torn down, I believe, in the mid-1980s, but it was right across the street. It later became an asylum for the mentally challenged in many instances. But before that, it was a real hotel. And it was built by William B. Post, who was an incredibly important art, built City College campus, built many, many buildings around the country in the 19th and early 20th century. The most beautiful thing about that building, and I remember it because we lived on the 14th story, so our window was more or less the datum of the dome of that building. There's this beautiful dome, and at night, off the light of the moon, you would see these beautiful tiles. I don't know how, to this day, I don't know how they did that, but it was an iridescent kind of color and light that would come from that dome. So when I draw circles, to me it's a reminder, you've got to build a dome. And sometimes the circles that end up in some of these drawings, perhaps they're not measuring what's in the drawing. Some of them are, but I think some of them are markers for the future. But I better get down to business, because apparently labor on dome construction is like through the roof these days. So, but that's the story.
First of all, thank you for coming. Well, I was not just struck me, I did say, blessed to teach with that and learn from it. 10 years. I learned so much from it, I can't believe it. One of the things I wanted to point out, I thought, and maybe it started in my head from Michael's first question about the viscosity and gravity. And I think what was beautiful in what you did was the triptych of architecture and education, in the sense that the gravity of each one of them is ultimately atmospheric. And that there's the arts of teaching and learning, the architectonics of teaching and learning, architectonics of curiosity, creating spaces of curiosity. It takes all of the material and all the effort and all the energy that is poured into it, and ultimately what we've created is an atmosphere. And architecture, right? Articulate substance. That's going to be stone, that's going to be wood, that's going to be paint, it's going to be steel, it's going to be glass. Ultimately, what we're making is space. What we're actually authoring is the atmosphere between all of those things. I think it's an incredibly important lesson that you just gave of that relationship, of that in painting, in architecture, and in education. I'm talking about the discipline of and arts of teaching and learning. I think it's a beautiful, you gotta put this book out there, like Albert's book.
No,
Really?
not the 5 of them, just one.
One of the 5.
One at a time.
The atmospheres of curiosity. Well, thank you.
Well, I thank you, and I should say, we, as Professor Kristen mentioned, he and I taught here together for 10 years, and I was a student of David 3 times in the studio. In second year with Professor Zuliani, then in third year again, and in fourth year again. So I'm following you, must be following me. And I see Professor O'Donnell, who, speaking of gravity, structures professor. I still owe you that moment distribution exam back.
I know.
It's on the list. Don't worry.
It's up.
Thank you.
Right here.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I was just wondering about your work. I was wondering, why did you fold your work the way that you did? Was it purely for aesthetics, or was there a system behind it with rules?
Aesthetic or system? I'm going to maybe translate aesthetic to maybe loose lack of rules, if rules is on. So is it fair to say, or is it fair to rephrase your question in this way? Is the work premeditated and built from a set of predetermined rules, or does it unfold as it's being made? I would say it probably unfolds as it's being made. And, this question between chance and control, I think is interesting, that you discover something as you're making and listening. And, I'm always fascinated by thinkers and artists who can work in a way where they know from, like Albers, it's fascinating to me because I can't imagine how someone could discipline themselves in a certain way to say, I'm only going to work with this for 10, 20 years or 50 years in certain instances. But you see the results of it and you say, wow, that's an incredible way to work. I think, and I'm not putting myself out, but I'm just making a contrast. I think it's incredible to discover something. I mean, for me, the only interesting thing about life is you don't know what's going to happen. You wake up and tomorrow, a lot of amazing things are going to happen to you. Most of them you won't notice, which is why they're so amazing. And I would hope that the process of creating something is like that. I do understand that when you get into disciplines that are perhaps more collective in nature, like the designing of spaces to be built, you're working with hundreds, if not thousands of people, even on a small quote unquote building. So the method of exchange and communication in that process, I would think, has to be more structured and based on a set of rules that can be understood by many. In my case, I don't want to say this too loosely, but I don't care about rules in this sense. But you got to put your time in first, I think, before you can not care.
But maybe not rules, but having now followed your work for close to 20 years, I see a continuity from the start till today. You're working on that space that's right in front of and right into the wall. You're working continually with frame and what the frame is stretching and supporting, becoming disfigured and or disarticulated from it. And pigment itself as a material, as something that is often monochrome, but pigment. So there's maybe not rules, but constraints.
Yes.
Or a limited, almost the ways in which you set up the discussion about Alice.
Yes. You're right. Thank you. That's a very important. Actually, I'm going to walk back a little. That's an important correction. Limitations are important, and we all have them a certain way, right? It can be, hey, listen, only one color per piece, or dominant color. Maybe it would be better with 10, I don't know, but one gives you a place where you can say, okay, I'm going to accept this limit for now. And I think what's important is if you work long enough on something, and long doesn't have to do with time, it can just be the focus, the concentration, other things appear as possibilities. But I appreciate your observation about continuity of work. I mean, I look back at some of earlier work, which again is not in this talk, and a lot of it doesn't exist anymore. It's been unmade and undone. It's probably in some of these pieces. I don't remember, honestly. But, I think there's something also important about the taking apart of something and the dismantling of a work, and that there isn't necessarily anything that's so precious that it can't come apart and be reconstituted. And that there's something that travels, if not in your own mind, then lucky enough the minds of your friends or your colleagues to say, hey, remember that thing and that? Like, yeah, I did do that. We're getting there.
Yeah. There's a question.
Thank you. I have actually, there's an image that you showed of your painting where it was from, there was line on the floor, like one. And that kind of brought up two questions for me. One of them is, how do you define your work in relation to sculpture? And this particularly interests me because you bring up Michelangelo as this great painter, but he said that he preferred sculpture. So I'm curious about where you define your own work. And then the second question would be, how does your work start? Does it start vertically, always in relationship to the wall, or does it grow to become something that is thought of as like oriented on a vertical surface rather than on a flat horizontal surface?
Wow, thank you. The few times I tried to make sculpture, I ended up making flat, planar things that were probably closer to conventional paintings than sculpture. So maybe I've got things cross-wired in my brain, and I honestly don't think about sculpture that often, if ever. It doesn't. I wake up thinking about painting or an architectural, like a section that I've seen or a sketch. I think of Piranesi's Carteret. I think of film. I never think of sculpture, but it's a beautiful question because, maybe it's just I'm like a repressed sculptor, really just got pushed in between these two places, but I don't want to say it. But I'll keep thinking about that. But to your other question, how do I start? Usually with what's lying around. And more recently, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work has just migrated from one state to another. So something that I thought was finished, but then it's embarrassing me, but I'm afraid to destroy it because I think there is something in there somewhere. When I finally have the courage to say, okay, I can take that apart and make it part of something else, it becomes part of something else. So I don't know if I have an absolute starting point. When I was much younger and I would work on stretched canvas, I could absolutely say this is the starting point. I stretched the canvas, I primed it with gesso, and then there's the first layer of paint. Here I'm not so sure where they start, but I know they have multiple histories of all of the pieces. Thank you.
I'm wondering, because you don't mention it in your talk, and thank you very much for such a dense and complex presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, though, the one thing that hasn't been touched on, or this maybe is because I choose to look at the work in a specific way, but how intensely figural. You say you don't think in terms of sculpture, and yet you started your talk by mentioning Michelangelo and the Sistine ceiling, and how he protested doing it because what he really would have preferred is to make sculpture. You're quite right, that's what he would have preferred. He complained bitterly throughout about the wax stripping on. So I guess I am trusting you, my own associations with your earliest work that coming forward now, but I think the figure and the gesture of the figure in space, I think, what do you think of that? Is it there for you, or is it?
I have to think about that. I would say, genetically, yes, because of I have a body,
Yeah.
and I am a body. So yeah, I would think just, the incredible intense training, hundreds of thousands of drawings of the figure in first year and in the 4 years after. I don't know how Monica let me take the same class for 4 years in a row.
She doesn't anymore.
Oh, okay. I think I got somebody in trouble. But yeah, I assume I would.
With the Titus.
I would assume so, to answer your question, that that the body is there as a ghost lurking beneath, an apparition perhaps, and I don't have any predictions about the future other than what's immediately in front of me. But I think as your body changes, your thought on bodies change. As you start maybe rigidly, and slowly you kind of relax over time. And I think if I were to maybe make a contrast between some of the recent 7-year ago, 10-year ago work, it was a lot tighter, uptight, and then it got, I would say, looser in a way, and accepting of accident and of things that are outside of your initial intent or planning. So back to your wonderful question about limitations or rules, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, I tried to make them, but sometimes when you forget them, maybe you get something more compelling in the end. So there's a body always there somewhere. Let's see. Thank you.
Because I do find them, despite certain intellectual premises, I do find them remarkably sensual and gestural. And I wonder even that they need the stretcher. They're just flying off.
Okay, you heard it here. All right.
Yes, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so thanks, Michael, and Anthony, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I saw your installation at T-Space and enjoyed it a lot. And I think having listened to you talk about it tonight and thinking about this notion of continuity in the work, even though your work has really changed a lot over time, what I kind of found myself appreciating and really enjoying in this was your inversion of the structure of a painting. So, and you brought up the issue of stretching a canvas. So there is a tectonic there of the stretcher and the canvas on the stretcher, and then the image on the canvas. So the layering of structure is pretty clear. And you totally inverted it, because the canvas is not tensed often in any way by that pre-stressing on the frame. But occasionally there were these frames still visible in the thickness of the painting. And it was the paint itself that had become the structure of the painting. And so I just, I kind of found myself really enjoying it, almost like as this incredibly lovely cosmic inversion. So yeah, it was really quite a remarkable thing to experience, that complete inversion of the classic notion of a painting.
Well, thank you. And can I also ask in public, can I use that title, Cosmic Inversion, for the fourth book? You heard it here, all right? Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe have time for one more question. Yeah, Les.
Thank you immensely. Thank you. Really instrumental. Perhaps this is the same but in a different light as the question of Sue's, but in the lecture, either you didn't say it or I missed it, but the word anatomical. And when I was thinking of that word, there's a certain air of dissection to it, and that in order to understand this work as anatomical, if we are to do so, there is a body, and there is the anatomical body. And I'm wondering whether or not the body registers itself as these paintings, or if that anatomical apparition is inherent to the body of painting as its lineage, as something that has held body for a long time, and if this is simply the apparition in another way that it is, being revealed to us.
It's always great to have the last question be a really easy one. Oh, okay. In the most, that's a beautiful question. I don't have a very good answer for it, perhaps, but I have more maybe to think about from it. But I would say I would the question of the anatomical or the structural, that which is within, sometimes without, and the apparition, which is often something that is not seen but felt in a way, is a paradox that I'm working with. But I certainly appreciate your bringing to light this question of painting as a body itself, which is probably more recent in a certain way, given the consciousness of surface for so many centuries, but perhaps the body of painting is bodily in a very ancient way if one thinks of caves. I mean, that is the shaping, the image is shaped over what we assume to be a very, very unpredictable, beautiful landscape, right, which is very bodily. So maybe these paintings are just very, very archaic and ancient in a certain way. And I look forward to thinking about this question, the body as it moves over time and what it can become. And if you'd be so kind as to have me back at some point, I'd love to share some of those thoughts with you as well.
Thank you.
You've been very generous with your time. I appreciate it.
Awesome.